She signed the wrong document. The Duke refused to void it. You're mine now. The offices of Messrs. Hartwell and Associates smelled of old paper, ink, and the particular mustiness that seemed to cling to all establishments where men in dusty wigs conducted important business. Arabella Thornwood sat in a hard wooden chair against the wall, watching her mother flutter about the cramped waiting area like a butterfly trapped in a jar, while her younger sister Cordelia examined her reflection in the small mirror she always carried in her reticule. "Do you think Viscount Pemberton will be here?" Mrs. Thornwood asked for the 5th time in as many minutes. It would be most improper if he were not present for the signing of his own betrothal contract. Most improper indeed. "The Viscount's solicitor assured us he would attend, Mamma," Arabella said, her voice carrying the patient, measured tone she had perfected over years of managing her mother's anxieties. "And even if he does not, the contract will be equally binding. That is rather the point of having everything in writing." "You would know about such things." Her mother sniffed, the familiar note of disappointment threading through her words. "Always with your nose in account books and legal documents. It's no wonder." She stopped herself, but Arabella could finish the sentence perfectly well on her own. "It's no wonder you never received a single offer of marriage." Cordelia looked up from her mirror, her perfect rosebud lips curving into a smile that never quite reached her cornflower blue eyes. "Arabella doesn't mind, do you, Bella? She likes being useful, and once I'm Viscountess Pemberton, I shall make sure she always has a comfortable place in our household. Perhaps she could manage the nursery." "How generous," Arabella murmured, her fingers tightening imperceptibly on the worn fabric of her practical brown pelisse. She had chosen the garment deliberately this morning, the colour of mud, the cut 3 seasons out of fashion, because today was not about her. Today was about securing Cordelia's future, about saving the Thornwood family from the genteel poverty that had been creeping closer with each passing year since Papa's death. Today was about being useful, as she had always been useful. The door to the inner offices opened, and a harried-looking clerk appeared, his spectacles askew and ink stains on his fingers. "Mrs. Thornwood? Miss Cordelia Thornwood? Mr. Hartwell will see you now, if you'll follow me, please." Mrs. Thornwood surged forward, dragging Cordelia with her, leaving Arabella to trail behind as she always did. The clerk led them through a narrow corridor lined with doors, each bearing brass nameplates of various solicitors and legal professionals, until they reached a modest office at the end. Mr. Hartwell was a portly man with kind eyes and a nervous habit of adjusting his wig. He rose as they entered, gesturing to the chairs arranged before his desk. "Ladies, welcome, welcome. Please do sit. I trust your journey was not too arduous." "We hired a hack," Mrs. Thornwood said, as though this were a grave sacrifice rather than a simple economy. "But we are here, as promised, to sign dear Cordelia's betrothal contract. The Viscount, is he coming?" "Lord Pemberton sends his regrets. Pressing business in the House of Lords, I'm afraid. But his signature is already affixed to the document, so we need only Miss Cordelia's and, of course, the witness signatures." Mr. Hartwell shuffled through the papers on his desk, frowning slightly. "Now, if you'll just give me a moment, I seem to have... the contracts were being prepared this morning alongside several others, you see, and my clerk has been rather overwhelmed." He excused himself, disappearing through a side door into what appeared to be a larger chamber beyond. Arabella could hear the murmur of voices, the rustle of papers, and what sounded like a heated discussion happening somewhere nearby. Through the partially open door, she glimpsed another office, grander than this one, where a tall figure in an impeccably tailored dark coat stood with his back to her. "This is taking forever," Cordelia complained, examining a loose thread on her glove. "Mamma, I'm to meet Lady Catherine at 2 o'clock for ices at Gunter's. If we don't hurry—" "Hush, darling. This is important business. Arabella, go see what's keeping Mr. Hartwell, won't you?" Arabella rose obediently, moving toward the side door. Before she could knock, a young clerk, different from the first, even more harried-looking, thrust a sheaf of papers into her hands. "The contract for signature, miss. Mr. Hartwell says if you could witness where indicated, he'll be along directly. Terribly sorry for the delay. We've had 3 major estates in today, and the Duke's business has thrown everything into chaos. The clerk was already turning away, disappearing back into the labyrinthine offices. Arabella looked down at the papers in her hands. The document was thick, official-looking, covered in the dense legal language she had become familiar with through years of managing household accounts and reviewing lease agreements. At the top, in elegant copperplate script, she could make out the words, "Contract of Marriage." She carried the papers back to Mr. Hartwell's desk, settling into the chair the solicitor had vacated. Her mother and Cordelia were engaged in a whispered discussion about the seating arrangements at the upcoming Pemberton dinner party, paying her no attention whatsoever. The document before her was clearly a marriage contract. That much was evident from the format and the formal legal phrasing. Arabella's eyes scanned the pages with practiced efficiency, looking for the signature lines. There at the bottom of the final page, she could see a bold, masculine signature already in place. The ink dark and confident. The groom's signature, she assumed. Lord Pemberton's. Below it were 2 additional lines marked "Witness," and below those, another line simply marked for the bride's signature. Arabella chewed her lip. She should wait for Mr. Hartwell, of course. But the clerk had said to witness where indicated, and time was pressing, and she could hear her mother's increasingly anxious commentary about the hour. What could it hurt to sign as witness now? She was, after all, the practical one, the useful one, the one who made things happen while others fluttered and fretted. She reached for the quill on Mr. Hartwell's desk, dipped it in the inkwell, and signed her name on the first witness line with the quick, efficient strokes that characterized everything she did. Arabella Thornwood. The ink gleamed wetly on the page, and Arabella felt a small surge of satisfaction. One task accomplished, at least. Now, if only. The door to the adjoining office slammed open with such force that Arabella startled, dropping the quill and leaving a small splatter of ink across the page. "What the devil do you mean the contract is missing?" The voice was deep, cold, and carried the unmistakable ring of authority. Arabella looked up to find the tall figure she had glimpsed earlier, now striding into Mr. Hartwell's modest office, his presence seeming to consume all the available air in the room. He was, quite simply, the most arresting man she had ever seen. Tall, considerably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that tapered to a lean waist, he moved with the controlled power of a predator who had never encountered anything he could not master. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, falling across a broad forehead in waves that suggested a carelessness at odds with the severity of his tailored clothing. But it was his face that captured her attention. All sharp angles and hard planes, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones that spoke of aristocratic breeding, dominated by eyes the colour of storm clouds over the Thames. Those eyes, at this moment, were blazing with cold fury. "The contract," he said again, each word precisely clipped. "The marriage contract. It was on the desk not 5 minutes ago, and now—" His gaze swept the room, passing over Mrs. Thornwood, who had pressed a hand to her bosom in alarm, Cordelia, who was staring at him with undisguised appreciation, and finally landing on Arabella, or more precisely, on the papers spread before her. The papers upon which her signature still gleamed wetly. "What?" the man said, his voice dropping to a register that made Arabella's spine stiffen. "Are you doing with that document?" Arabella looked down at the contract, then back up at the furious stranger. "I was witnessing my sister's betrothal contract. The clerk gave it to me, and—" "Your sister's betrothal contract." He was across the room in 3 strides, snatching the papers from the desk before she could protest. His eyes scanned the pages rapidly, and Arabella watched the colour drain from his face before being replaced by a flush of what could only be described as apoplectic rage. "This is not a betrothal contract." "I beg your pardon?" "This," he said, thrusting the papers toward her, "is a marriage contract, my marriage contract, with a special license already attached. And you," his finger stabbed toward her signature, "have just signed it, not as a witness, you foolish woman, as the bride." The world seemed to tilt oddly on its axis. Arabella grabbed the papers back, her eyes frantically scanning the text she had only skimmed before. And there it was, plain as day, now that she knew what she was looking at. Contract of marriage between His Grace, Sebastian Ashworth, Duke of Blackmore, and the line for the bride's name had been left blank, awaiting completion. But below it, the signature line, she now saw the small notation. Bride's signature, not witness. Her signature, her name, Arabella Thornwood. "Oh, God," she breathed. "Indeed." The Duke of Blackmore, for it could only be him, looked as though he were contemplating murder. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I was to marry Lady Patience Whitmore. The contract was prepared, the special license obtained, the arrangements made, and now, thanks to your incompetence—" "My incompetence?" Arabella found herself on her feet, the initial shock giving way to a defensive anger that had served her well through years of small humiliations. "Your clerk handed me this document. Your solicitor's office is apparently so chaotic that marriage contracts are simply lying about for anyone to sign. And you dare blame me? You signed a legal document without reading it properly. I signed what I was told was my sister's betrothal contract, in a solicitor's office, where one might reasonably expect the correct paperwork to be provided." They were nearly nose to nose now, or rather, nose to chest, given the significant difference in their heights. Arabella had to crane her neck to maintain eye contact. But she refused to back down, refused to cower before this arrogant aristocrat who thought he could blame her for his own household's incompetence. "Arabella!" Her mother's voice cut through the confrontation, high and trembling. "What is happening? Who is this gentleman? Why are you shouting?" Mr. Hartwell had reappeared in the doorway, his face the colour of old cheese. "Your Grace, I cannot apologize enough. The contracts were on adjacent desks, and my clerk, he's new, Your Grace, and with the volume of work today—" "I do not care about your clerk's inadequacies," the Duke said, not taking his eyes from Arabella's face. "I care about the fact that this woman has just signed a legally binding marriage contract with my name already upon it. A contract attached to a special license that I obtained through considerable effort and expense." "Surely it can be voided," Arabella said, hating the slight quaver in her voice. "It was clearly a mistake, an accident. No court would hold such a contract valid when both parties were deceived." "Both parties?" The Duke's eyebrow arched. "I was not the one who signed the wrong document, Miss Thornwood. Miss Arabella Thornwood." She lifted her chin. "And I signed what I was given. If you had kept better control of your own affairs, this would not have happened." Something flickered in those grey eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a grudging acknowledgement of her point. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Arabella became uncomfortably aware of how she must appear. Plain brown pelisse, hair escaping its pins, ink stains on her fingers, the very picture of a faded spinster who had never merited a second glance from any man, let alone a duke. "You have a sharp tongue, Miss Thornwood," he said finally. "I have been reliably informed that it is one of my many failings, Your Grace." She met his gaze steadily. "Now, if we could return to the matter at hand, how do we void this contract? I am quite certain neither of us wishes to be bound by it." The Duke was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Mr. Hartwell. "Leave us. Your Grace? You, the other ladies, your incompetent clerks, leave us. I will speak with Miss Thornwood alone." "Oh, I really don't think—" Mrs. Thornwood began, but something in the Duke's expression silenced her. She gathered Cordelia with a flutter of anxious hands and allowed Mr. Hartwell to escort them from the room, casting worried glances over her shoulder until the door closed behind them. Arabella stood her ground, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "If you intend to intimidate me into accepting blame for this situation, Your Grace, I should warn you. Sit down, Miss Thornwood. I prefer to stand. And I prefer to have this conversation without craning my neck like a startled heron. Sit down." It was not a request. Arabella sat. The Duke did not sit. He moved to the window, looking out at the grey London street below, his profile sharp as a blade against the watery light. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful, the rage seemingly banked for the moment. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Thornwood." "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me. You have just inadvertently become my wife, at least on paper. I find myself curious about the woman who has upended months of careful negotiation with a single stroke of her pen." Arabella pressed her lips together. "There is little to tell, Your Grace. I am the eldest daughter of the late Mr. Harold Thornwood, a gentleman of modest means. My mother is a widow. My sister, whom you saw, is Miss Cordelia Thornwood, who is shortly to become Viscountess Pemberton. Or she will be, once the correct contract is located and signed. And you? No husband? No betrothed?" The familiar sting of the question, the implication behind it, made her voice sharper than she intended. "As you can see, Your Grace, I am firmly on the shelf, 24, unwed, and unlikely to alter that state. I keep my mother's household accounts, manage the servants, and ensure that my sister's far more promising future proceeds without incident. Does that satisfy your curiosity?" He turned from the window, studying her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "You manage accounts, servants, practical matters. I am a practical woman, Your Grace. It is my chief, some would say, only virtue. And yet you signed a marriage contract without reading it." Her cheeks flamed. "A mistake I shall not repeat, I assure you." "No," he said slowly, something shifting in his expression. "You won't." He moved to the desk, picking up the contract and examining it once more. Arabella watched him, trying to read his intentions in the set of his shoulders, the slight furrow of his brow. When he finally looked at her again, his decision seemed already made. "This contract is legally binding," he said. "Surely not." "There are provisions for... It is attached to a special license. That license bears today's date. The contract has my signature, completed before witnesses in this very office not an hour past, and your signature, also witnessed by your presence in this establishment, and the ink that matches the pot on that desk. Under English law, Miss Thornwood, we are married." The words hit her like a physical blow. "That cannot be. I never agreed. You never agreed." "What I agreed to was a marriage. The specific bride was, I confess, meant to be different, but the contract is valid." He paused, and something that might have been amusement flickered at the corner of his mouth. "You argued not 5 minutes ago that I should accept responsibility for the chaos in this office. By that same logic, I accepted a contract that bore a blank line for the bride's name. Perhaps fate has simply filled in that blank." "Fate? Your Grace, this is not some romantic novel. This is a legal catastrophe that must be remedied immediately. I have no desire to be your wife, and I cannot imagine you have any desire for a wife such as me. A wife such as you." He repeated the words as though tasting them. "And what sort of wife would that be, Miss Thornwood? A practical woman with a sharp tongue who keeps accounts and manages households? Who argues with a duke in his own solicitor's office and refuses to accept blame for mistakes that were not her own? A plain spinster with no fortune, no connections, and no accomplishments worth mentioning," she shot back. "A woman so unremarkable that she has spent 10 years watching her mother parade eligible gentlemen before her younger sister, while pretending not to notice that not a single one ever looked twice in her direction. That, Your Grace, is the wife your precious contract has saddled you with. Now can we please discuss how to undo this disaster?" The Duke was very still. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, all trace of mockery gone. "You believe yourself unremarkable. I believe myself realistic. There is a difference." "Is there?" He set down the contract and moved toward her, stopping only when he was close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Let me tell you what I see, Miss Thornwood. I see a woman who has spent years being overlooked and undervalued, who has convinced herself that being useful is the same as being unworthy of anything more. I see a woman who argues with logic rather than tears, who takes responsibility for managing a household while others take her efforts for granted, who possesses a spine of steel wrapped in a practical brown pelisse. Arabella could not breathe, could not think, could not understand why this man, this impossible, arrogant, coldly beautiful man, was looking at her as though he saw something worth examining. "The marriage contract I prepared with Lady Patience was a business arrangement," he continued. "Her family desired the connection to my title. I desired nothing particularly. A duchess to manage my household, produce an heir, and otherwise leave me in peace. Lady Patience was acceptable because she expected nothing from me, and I expected nothing from her. Then why not void this contract and proceed with that arrangement? Surely Lady Patience is interchangeable with any other woman of good breeding and no imagination." His grey eyes held hers, storm clouds gathering. "You, Miss Thornwood, are not interchangeable with anyone." "You don't know me. We met not 15 minutes ago, under the most absurd circumstances imaginable. I know that you stood your ground when I raged at you. I know that you called me arrogant to my face without flinching. I know that you have spent years being made to feel invisible, and have survived it with your wit and your dignity intact." He reached out, and before she could react, his finger caught a strand of honey-brown hair that had escaped her pins, tucking it gently behind her ear. "I know that you signed that contract with an efficient hand and a clear signature, asking no one's permission and expecting no praise for getting the job done." Arabella's heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "You are mad?" "Quite possibly." His hand dropped back to his side, but he did not step away. "Nevertheless, I find myself disinclined to void this contract." "You cannot be serious." "I am always serious, Miss Thornwood. Ask anyone who has had the misfortune to do business with me." The ghost of a smile crossed his harsh features. "The contract is valid. The license is valid. And I find that I prefer an accidental wife with spirit and intelligence to a chosen wife with neither. I have not agreed to this. You signed the contract. Your agreement is a matter of legal record. Under false pretenses, I thought I believed—" She was sputtering, she realized, all her vaunted composure crumbling in the face of his implacable certainty. "Your Grace, please, be reasonable. This is madness. You cannot simply decide to keep a wife you never intended to marry, a woman you know nothing about, simply because what?" She didn't know. She couldn't articulate what she was trying to say, because nothing about this situation made any sense. Dukes did not marry plain spinsters by accident and then decide to keep them. Coldly handsome aristocrats did not look at women like her as though they were puzzles worth solving. The world did not work that way, had never worked that way, not once in her 24 years of practical, unremarkable existence. "I am not a choice any man would make deliberately," she finally said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "And yet, I am making it." He stepped back, giving her room to breathe, and picked up the contract once more. "You will come to Blackmore House with me today. We will inform your family of our unusual marriage, and then we will proceed as husband and wife." "Just like that? No courtship, no understanding, no—" "The courtship is traditionally meant to precede the wedding, Miss Thornwood. In our case, we shall simply have to manage it in reverse order." He folded the contract and slid it into his coat. "I suggest you say goodbye to your mother and sister. You will see them again, of course, but you will not be returning to their household." Arabella sat frozen in her chair, watching this stranger, this husband. Her mind whispered hysterically, "Move toward the door." At the threshold, he paused and looked back at her. "You accused me of arrogance, Miss Thornwood. You were not wrong. But I wonder if you have considered that you suffer from a similar affliction." "I beg your pardon?" "You have decided what you are worth, and you resent anyone who disagrees with your assessment." His grey eyes held something she couldn't name. "I look forward to proving you wrong." He opened the door and spoke to someone in the corridor beyond Mr. Hartwell, she assumed, or perhaps one of the clerks. Arabella could hear her mother's voice rising in questioning alarm. Cordelia's higher tones joining in. In a matter of moments, her entire life had been overturned by a misfiled document and a duke's inexplicable whim. The conversation that followed was, in many ways, more difficult than the confrontation with the duke. Mrs. Thornwood's reactions cycled rapidly through confusion, disbelief, horror, and as the implications of her eldest daughter's new title began to sink in barely concealed triumph. "A duchess," she kept repeating, as though saying the word often enough would make it real. "My Arabella, a duchess. But the contract was for Cordelia and Lord Pemberton." "Lord Pemberton's contract was located on an adjacent desk," the Duke said coldly. "Your younger daughter's betrothal remains intact. It is only my marriage that has been unexpectedly concluded." "But why would you? That is to say, Arabella is a wonderful girl, of course, but she's not. She isn't." "She is my wife," the Duke cut in, and something in his tone silenced Mrs. Thornwood's fumbling. "The circumstances are irregular, I grant you, but the contract is binding, and I see no reason to contest it." Cordelia was staring at Arabella with an expression that hovered somewhere between astonishment and jealousy. "You're to be a duchess? You? But you're plain, practical, on the shelf?" Arabella heard her own voice as though from a great distance. "Yes, I'm aware. And yet here we are. Here we are indeed." The Duke offered his arm with a formality that felt almost mocking. "Shall we, Your Grace?" The title hit her like a splash of cold water. Your Grace. She was a duchess. She was married. She was leaving this office on the arm of a man she had known for less than an hour, going to a house she had never seen, to begin a life she had never imagined. "My things," she managed, "my clothes, my books, will be sent for. I keep an excellent staff. They will ensure you have everything you need." "Arabella." Her mother caught her hand, eyes suddenly bright with tears. "Arabella, I know I haven't always, that is. I may have sometimes." "It's all right, Mamma." And strangely, in that moment, it was. Whatever came next, she was no longer the overlooked daughter, the useful spinster, the one who managed things while others shone. She was stepping into something unknown, something terrifying, something that made no logical sense whatsoever. But she was stepping into it as a duchess, as a wife, as a woman who had been chosen, however accidentally, however inexplicably, by a man who could have had anyone. She took the Duke's arm. The carriage ride to Blackmore House was conducted largely in silence. The Duke sat across from her, his long legs taking up more than their fair share of the space. His grey eyes fixed on her with that unnerving intensity she was beginning to realize might be his habitual expression. Arabella stared out the window, watching London pass by in a blur of grey streets and grey skies. The neighbourhoods grew steadily more fashionable as they travelled, the houses larger and more imposing, until they turned onto a square she recognised as one of the most exclusive addresses in Mayfair. Blackmore House dominated one entire side of the square. It was massive, elegant, and somehow cold, all pale stone and tall windows that reflected the overcast sky like mirrors. Servants in immaculate livery materialized as the carriage stopped, opening doors and setting down steps with mechanical precision. "Welcome to your new home, Your Grace," the Duke said, a slight edge to his voice that might have been irony. "I trust you will find it adequate." Adequate. The entrance hall alone was larger than the entire ground floor of her mother's modest townhouse. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, a staircase that swept upward in a grand curve. It was beautiful and intimidating and utterly overwhelming. "Mrs. Blackwood." The Duke addressed a thin, sour-faced woman who had appeared from somewhere within the house's depths. "This is the new Duchess of Blackmore. Please show her to the Duchess's apartments and ensure she has everything she requires." The housekeeper's expression flickered surprise, quickly suppressed before settling into professional blankness. "Of course, Your Grace. If you'll follow me, Your Grace." The repetition of the title felt pointed, almost mocking. Arabella lifted her chin and followed the woman up that sweeping staircase, very conscious of the Duke's gaze on her back. The Duchess's apartments were a series of rooms that seemed designed for a woman very different from herself, all gilt and pale silk and delicate furniture that looked as though it might collapse if anyone actually sat on it. The bedroom was dominated by an enormous four-poster bed hung with blue velvet, and Arabella tried very hard not to think about the implications of that bed, or of the connecting door she noticed on the far wall. "Dinner is served at 8, Mrs. Blackwood said, her tone suggesting that tardiness would be met with severe disapproval. "His Grace dresses for dinner. If you require a lady's maid, I can assign one of the housemaids until more permanent arrangements are made." "That would be—" "Yes. Thank you." The housekeeper departed, and Arabella sank onto the edge of the bed that looked too fragile to support actual human weight. To her relief, it held. She was married. She was a duchess. She was sitting in a bedroom larger than any room she had ever occupied, in a house that could swallow her mother's home several times over, wearing her practical brown pelisse with ink stains on her fingers. And in a few hours, she would have to go down to dinner and face the man who had, for reasons she still could not begin to fathom, refused to void their accidental marriage. "You're mine now," he had said, or words to that effect, as though she were a piece of property that had fallen into his possession through some quirk of legal fate. But there had been something else in his eyes, hadn't there? Something that looked almost like interest, curiosity, perhaps even a hint of admiration. "I look forward to proving you wrong." Arabella stood and moved to the window, looking out over the square below. She could just see the corner of the park, the trees bare and grey in the late autumn light. Somewhere out there, Cordelia was probably at Gunther's by now, eating ices with Lady Catherine and crowing about her sister's impossible good fortune. Her mother was likely already planning how to exploit the connection to a duke. And here she was, alone in a strange house, about to embark on a marriage she had never sought with a man she did not know. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept the household running for years, that had balanced impossible budgets and managed difficult servants and navigated her mother's endless anxieties, began to stir. She was good at managing impossible situations. She had been doing it all her life. Perhaps this was simply another challenge to be met, another problem to be solved. The Duke of Blackmore thought he had acquired a useful wife. Very well. She would show him just how useful she could be. And if, in the process, she discovered what had truly motivated him to keep her, what game he might be playing, what hidden agenda lurked behind those storm-grey eyes, well, that would simply be practical, wouldn't it? Dinner was a formal affair conducted in a dining room large enough to seat 30, but set for only 2, she and the Duke at opposite ends of a table, so long that normal conversation was impossible. They ate in near silence, served by footmen whose faces betrayed nothing, while Arabella tried to pretend that this was perfectly normal and not at all the most surreal experience of her entire existence. Afterward, the Duke escorted her to a drawing-room decorated in shades of cream and gold, where a fire crackled in an enormous marble fireplace. He poured her a glass of sherry she hadn't asked for, and settled into a chair across from hers. Watching her with that penetrating gaze, she was beginning to find simultaneously irritating and unsettling. "You have questions," he said. It was not a question. "I have approximately 1,000 questions, Your Grace. I hardly know where to begin." "Sebastian." "I beg your pardon?" "My name is Sebastian. We are married, Miss Thornwood, or should I say, Your Grace." "It seems absurd to stand on such formality in private." "Then you must call me Arabella." The name felt strange on her lips, too intimate for this beautiful, cold stranger. "Although I confess I still cannot quite believe any of this is real." "It is real." He swirled the brandy in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. "I assure you, I do not make a habit of acquiring wives by accident and then deciding to keep them. This is as unprecedented for me as it is for you." "Then why?" The question burst out of her, the one that had been burning in her chest since that moment in the solicitor's office. Why not void the contract? Why not marry Lady Patience as you planned? I cannot believe that you simply chose me. On the basis of a 15-minute acquaintance and an argument about whose fault the mistake was. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost thoughtful. Do you know why I was marrying Lady Patience Whitmore? You mentioned a political alliance, I believe. Her father is the Earl of Hartington. He controls a significant block of votes in the House of Lords, votes I need for a shipping bill I've been developing for the past 2 years. The marriage was to secure his support. Arabella blinked. That seems rather cold. I am rather cold, Your Grace. Ask anyone. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close to it. Lady Patience understood the arrangement. She expected nothing from me, and I expected nothing from her. We would have rubbed along well enough, I imagine. Separate lives under the same roof, the occasional society appearance together, an heir at some point, perfectly civilized. And now? And now I find myself married to a woman who argues with me, who refuses to be intimidated, who has been systematically undervalued her entire life, and has somehow emerged with her wit and her spine intact. He set down his glass and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I don't know what kind of marriage we will have, Arabella, but I find myself curious to discover it. She should have been flattered. Perhaps she was flattered, somewhere beneath the layers of confusion and disbelief. But the practical part of her mind refused to accept this explanation at face value. You cannot have decided all of that in 15 minutes, she said. There must be something else. Some other reason. His expression flickered something dark and quickly hidden. Perhaps I simply enjoy confounding expectations, mine as well as others. It wasn't an answer, not really. But before she could press further, he rose from his chair and extended his hand. It's late, and this has been an eventful day. Allow me to escort you to your rooms. Arabella took his hand without thinking, and the shock of contact, his fingers warm and strong around hers, sent an unexpected jolt through her. She rose quickly, releasing his hand perhaps too hastily, and allowed him to lead her out of the drawing room and up the grand staircase. At the door to her apartments, he stopped. I should tell you, he said, his voice carefully neutral, that I do not intend to. That is, we need not. He paused, and Arabella realized with some shock that the Duke of Blackmore, this cold, commanding, impossibly self-possessed man, was struggling for words. You are saying that you will not expect me to fulfill the physical duties of a wife, she said, proud that her voice did not waver. Tonight, at least. Until you are ready. Until we know each other better. Until... He stopped, shook his head slightly. This marriage may have begun by accident, but I would not have you feel trapped. You will have time to adjust, to decide if this is truly what you want. I thought you said the contract was binding, that I was yours now. The contract is binding. His grey eyes held hers, and she saw something in them she couldn't name, something that looked almost like uncertainty. But I find I want more than a legal claim, Arabella. I want you to choose to stay. Before she could respond, before she could even begin to process this admission, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a brief, burning kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Your Grace. And he was gone, disappearing down the corridor toward his own rooms, leaving Arabella standing alone in the doorway of her new life, with her heart pounding and her thoughts in chaos. I want you to choose to stay. She slipped into her rooms and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as though the solid wood could somehow anchor her to reality. A maid was waiting, young, nervous, clearly unused to attending a duchess, and Arabella submitted to being helped out of her clothes and into a nightgown that was not her own, borrowed from some previous occupant of these rooms. The maid brushed out her hair and turned down the bed and asked if there was anything else her grace required, and Arabella sent her away with words she barely heard herself speak. And then she was alone, in that enormous bed with its blue velvet hangings, in this strange house that was now her home, married to a man she did not understand, who seemed, against all logic, to want her. "I want you to choose to stay." The words echoed in her mind as she lay in the darkness, staring up at the canopy above her. She had spent her entire life being practical, being sensible, being the one who expected nothing and received exactly that. She had told herself that love and passion and fairy tale endings were for women like Cordelia, beautiful women, charming women, women who had never had to manage household accounts or deal with creditors or pretend not to notice when suitors looked past them to prettier options. She had signed that contract thinking it was a witness line on her sister's betrothal, a small, practical task, nothing that would change her life. And now everything had changed. In the morning, she would have to face her new husband across another endless breakfast table. She would have to learn this house, meet the servants, figure out what was expected of a duchess. She would have to write to her mother, explain to Cordelia, somehow make sense of this impossible situation. But for now, in the quiet darkness, Arabella allowed herself one moment of something that felt dangerously like hope. He had looked at her, really looked at her as though she were worth seeing. He had called her remarkable in his cold, oblique way. He had said he wanted her to choose. Perhaps, just perhaps, she would. The first week of Arabella's marriage passed in a blur of awkward meals, unfamiliar rooms, and the constant, unnerving awareness of her husband's presence somewhere in the vast expanse of Blackmore House. Sebastian kept largely to his study during the days, emerging only for meals and the occasional evening hour in the drawing room, where they would sit in a silence that was not quite comfortable, but was no longer openly hostile. She learned the rhythms of the household quickly. It was what she did, after all, what she had always done. The servants rose at 6, the fires were lit by 7, breakfast was laid at 9 for her and 8 for the Duke, who kept earlier hours. Luncheon was informal, often taken on a tray in whatever room she happened to be occupying. Dinner remained the formal affair it had been on that first night, though Sebastian had ordered the table reset so they sat closer together, near enough for actual conversation, if either of them could think of anything to say. The household itself, she discovered, was a disaster hiding behind a veneer of aristocratic grandeur. "The accounts," Arabella said on the morning of her 8th day as Duchess, spreading the household ledgers across the desk in the small sitting room she had claimed as her own. "Mrs. Blackwood, these accounts they cannot be correct." The housekeeper stood before her, spine rigid, expression carefully blank. "I'm sure I don't know what your grace means. I mean that according to these figures, Blackmore House has spent more on candles in the past quarter than my mother's entire household spends in a year. I mean that the butcher's bills show purchases of cuts that have never appeared on any menu I've seen. I mean that either this house is feeding a secret army in the cellars, or someone has been padding these accounts rather substantially." Mrs. Blackwood's face went pale, then red. "Your Grace, I have been housekeeper here for 15 years. I served the previous Duke and Duchess, God rest their souls, and I am not accusing you of anything, Mrs. Blackwood." Arabella kept her voice calm, though she could feel her patience fraying. "I am simply observing that these numbers do not add up, and I should like to understand why." The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line. "His Grace has never concerned himself with household matters. He trusts me to manage things appropriately. I'm sure he does. However, I am now the Duchess of Blackmore, and I find that I am very much concerned with household matters. It is, as I have been told repeatedly throughout my life, one of my few useful qualities." She smiled, and it was not entirely friendly. "I should like to review all accounts from the past year, and I should like to meet with the cook, the butler, and the head footman this afternoon, separately." Mrs. Blackwood looked as though she had swallowed something bitter. "As your Grace wishes." When the housekeeper had gone, Arabella sat back in her chair and pressed her fingers to her temples. She had hoped naively, perhaps, that running a ducal household would be merely a larger version of running her mother's modest establishment. Instead, she was discovering layers of inefficiency, petty corruption, and outright neglect that made her head spin. The servants were terrified of Sebastian, she had realized. Not in the way that good servants respected a demanding master, but in a deeper way that spoke of years of cold dismissal and exacting standards applied without warmth. They jumped when he entered a room, avoided his gaze, spoke only when spoken to, and then in the shortest possible sentences. It was a household run on fear rather than loyalty, and it showed in every aspect of its operation. The irony was not lost on her. Sebastian had claimed to want a wife who could manage his household, and she was certainly capable of doing so. But the household she was inheriting was so thoroughly broken that fixing it would require more than simple competence. It would require a complete transformation of how Blackmore House operated. Rather like their marriage, she supposed. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." It was not a servant, but Sebastian himself who entered, and Arabella felt that now familiar flutter of awareness that his presence always provoked. He was dressed for riding, his dark hair slightly windswept, his cheeks flushed with cold. He looked, she thought irritably, unfairly handsome. "I saw Mrs. Blackwood in the corridor," he said without preamble. She looked as though someone had informed her that Christmas was cancelled. "Dare I ask what you said to her?" "I informed her that I would be reviewing the household accounts and meeting with the senior staff." Arabella kept her voice neutral. "She did not seem pleased by the prospect." Sebastian's eyebrows rose. "You're reviewing the accounts? Is that a problem?" "Not at all. I'm merely surprised." He moved into the room, his gaze falling on the ledgers spread across her desk. "I confess I've never paid much attention to household matters. I assumed Mrs. Blackwood had things well in hand." "She has things very firmly in her own hand," Arabella said dryly. "Whether that hand is reaching into your pockets is another question entirely." Sebastian was silent for a moment, studying her with that unreadable expression she was beginning to know well. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed a short, startled sound that transformed his stern features into something almost approachable. "You think Mrs. Blackwood is stealing from me?" "I think someone is, Your Grace. The accounts show expenditures that far exceed what any household this size should require, even accounting for the standards expected of a duke. Either your servants are monumentally wasteful, or a portion of your household budget is finding its way into pockets other than those of legitimate tradesmen. And you determined this after reviewing the books for how long? An hour? Perhaps 2? He shook his head slowly, but he was still smiling, a rare enough occurrence that Arabella found herself staring. "I believe I mentioned that you were remarkable, Miss Thornwood." "Arabella," she corrected automatically. "And there is nothing remarkable about basic arithmetic, Your Grace. Any competent housekeeper would have noticed the same discrepancies." "Sebastian." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of cold air and horse and something else, something warm and masculine that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "And the point is that our competent housekeeper did notice and chose to exploit rather than correct them. You've been here little more than a week, and already uncovered what I failed to see in years of neglect. You were busy with other matters, Parliament, business affairs, whatever it is that dukes do with their time. Whatever it is that dukes do." His smile turned wry. "I attend the House of Lords when required, manage estates scattered across 3 counties, invest in shipping ventures that my solicitors assure me are quite profitable, and generally attempt to live up to a title I never expected to inherit. My father was the Duke. I was merely the spare." Arabella blinked. "You weren't the heir?" "I had an older brother, Edward. He died when I was 15, a fever that took him in 3 days." Sebastian's voice was carefully flat, but Arabella heard the old pain beneath it. "My father never quite forgave me for surviving when his preferred son did not." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't know." "How could you? We've known each other barely a week, and most of that time has been spent circling each other like wary cats." He sat down in the chair across from her desk, stretching his long legs out before him in a posture that seemed almost deliberately casual. "Tell me about your family. Your father, you mentioned he died?" 7 years ago. A carriage accident. Arabella found herself matching his matter-of-fact tone. He was not a wealthy man, but he was kind, and he loved us. After he died, there was less money than anyone expected, and my mother, she found it difficult to adjust to reduced circumstances. And so the practical eldest daughter took over the household management. Someone had to. She shrugged. Cordelia was 14 and already beautiful. Everyone knew she would make a brilliant match if we could just manage to present her properly. I was 18 and already plain. It seemed obvious which of us should focus on securing the family's future, and which should focus on keeping us solvent until that future arrived. "You keep saying that?" Sebastian's voice was sharp. "Plain, unremarkable, on the shelf. As though these are established facts, rather than opinions." "They are established facts, Your Grace, Sebastian. I have a mirror. I have spent 10 years watching men look past me to my sister. I know what I am." "Do you?" He leaned forward, his grey eyes intent. "Do you know that your eyes are the colour of honey in sunlight, and that they flash like topazes when you're angry? Do you know that your hair, when it escapes its pins as it is doing now, I might add falls in waves that make a man want to bury his hands in it? Do you know that your mouth, when you're concentrating on those account books, curves in a way that is entirely distracting?" Arabella felt heat flooding her cheeks, and hoped desperately that her skin was not as red as it felt. You think yourself plain because you have been told so by people who couldn't see past the surface, by a mother who favoured your sister, by suitors too blind to notice that beauty fades, but intelligence and spirit do not. He sat back again, though his eyes never left her face. "I noticed, Arabella. In that solicitor's office, when you were covered in ink and arguing with me as though I were a recalcitrant shopkeeper rather than a duke, I noticed. And that's why you refused to void the contract?" She found her voice, though it wasn't quite steady. "Because you thought I was pretty?" "I refused to void the contract because I thought you were extraordinary. The prettiness is merely a pleasant bonus." He rose, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her. His hand twitched at his side as though fighting the impulse. Instead, he stepped back. "I have business in the city today. I'll return for dinner. Perhaps you might tell me then what you've discovered about our thieving servants." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her staring at the closed door with her heart racing and her thoughts in complete disarray. Extraordinary. No one had ever called her extraordinary before. No one had ever catalogued the colour of her eyes or the curve of her mouth, or suggested that her escaped hairpins were anything other than slovenly. She touched her hair self-consciously, tucking the errant strands back into place, and tried very hard to focus on the ledgers before her. She failed. The investigations into the household accounts consumed the next several days and revealed exactly what Arabella had suspected: a network of petty corruption that had been bleeding the Blackmore coffers for years. Mrs. Blackwood had been taking kickbacks from tradesmen, inflating orders and pocketing the difference. The cook had a similar arrangement with the butcher. 2 footmen had been selling off candle ends and other small items that no one bothered to track. It was depressingly familiar. Arabella had seen the same pattern in her mother's household on a smaller scale, and she knew exactly how to address it. What surprised her was Sebastian's reaction when she presented her findings. "You're certain of all this?" He studied the neat columns of figures she had prepared, his brow furrowed. "Quite certain. The evidence is in the accounts themselves, once you know what to look for. The question is, what you wish to do about it." "What I wish to do?" He looked up, something dark flickering in his eyes. "I wish to dismiss the lot of them without references, and see them prosecuted for theft." "That would be your right," Arabella said carefully. "However, I might suggest a less dramatic approach." "You would defend them? After they stole from this household?" I would observe that dismissing half your senior staff at once would leave Blackmore House in chaos, and that the amounts stolen, while significant in aggregate, are individually small enough that prosecution would likely fail. She kept her voice calm and reasonable, though she could see his temper building. I would also observe that the theft was made possible by years of neglect. If anyone had been paying attention to these accounts, it never would have reached this scale. Sebastian's jaw tightened. You're saying this is my fault. I'm saying there is blame enough to distribute, and that punishment without reform will simply create openings for the same corruption to take root again under new management. She met his gaze steadily. Dismiss Mrs. Blackwood. She is the ringleader and the most unrepentant. Offer the others a choice. Return what they've taken over a period of time, with the understanding that any future theft will result in immediate dismissal and prosecution, or leave immediately without references. Most will choose to stay and reform. Those who leave were never worth keeping. He was silent for a long moment, and Arabella could see him wrestling with his instincts. The Duke of Blackmore was not a man accustomed to mercy or half measures. Everything about him spoke of absolutes, of cold judgment rendered without appeal. But finally, he nodded. Very well, we'll try it your way. But if any of them steals so much as a candle stub, then you may prosecute to the fullest extent of the law with my complete support. She allowed herself a small smile. I am practical, Your Grace, not soft. Sebastian, he corrected, and there was warmth in his voice now. And I am beginning to understand the distinction. Mrs. Blackwood was dismissed that afternoon, escorted from the premises with her belongings packed, and no reference to ease her way to new employment. Arabella watched from an upstairs window as the woman climbed into a hired hack, her face a mask of fury and humiliation, and felt no satisfaction in the victory, only a grim determination to ensure it would not need to be repeated. The remaining servants took the offered bargain, most of them with visible relief. Arabella suspected many had been caught up in Mrs. Blackwood's schemes unwillingly, too afraid of the formidable housekeeper to refuse, and too certain of the Duke's indifference to report the corruption. With the ringleader gone, and a new Duchess who actually paid attention to household matters, the atmosphere began to shift. They're less frightened, Arabella observed to Sebastian one evening, as they sat together in the drawing-room after dinner. This had become something of a ritual over the past 2 weeks, an hour or two of conversation before they retired to their separate bedrooms, gradually learning the landscape of each other's lives. Less frightened of what? Of everything. Of you, particularly. She watched his face carefully, curious how he would react. You must know they were terrified of you. Sebastian's expression darkened. I have exacting standards. I do not apologize for that. Standards are one thing, but did you know that the footmen drew lots to determine who would serve at dinner, because no one wanted to be the one to make a mistake in your presence? That the maids would hide in cupboards when they heard your footsteps for fear of drawing your attention? He stopped, and she saw something shift in his face, a crack in the armor of certainty he wore so constantly. I did not know that. You were not cruel to them, I think, but you were cold, distant. You never spoke to them except to issue orders or criticisms. They had no sense of you as a person, only as a master to be feared. She softened her voice, aware that this was dangerous ground. It is not my place to tell you how to run your household, Sebastian, but I have found that servants who respect their employers work harder than those who merely fear them. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was rough. My father ran this household the same way. Cold, demanding, impossible to please. I swore I would never be like him, and yet we often become what we most despise without even noticing. Arabella reached out, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a week ago, and touched his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair. You are not your father, Sebastian. You chose to keep a wife you didn't plan for, against all logic and custom. You accepted my recommendations about the servants rather than following your first instinct. You are capable of change of warmth if you choose to allow it. His hand turned under hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. The contact was electric, sending shivers up her arm despite the warmth of the fire. You see things in me that I'm not certain exist, he said quietly. Or perhaps I see things you've buried so deeply you've forgotten they're there. She squeezed his hand gently. Either way, I have become quite invested in uncovering them. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. The air between them seemed to thrum with possibility. But instead, he raised their joined hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, just as he had done on their wedding night. "Good night, Arabella," he said, and released her. She watched him go, her hands still tingling where his lips had touched, and wondered how much longer either of them could maintain this careful distance. The invitation to the Whitmore ball arrived 3 weeks into their marriage, and it threw the fragile peace of Blackmore House into immediate turmoil. "We cannot possibly attend," Arabella said, staring at the elegant cream-coloured card as though it might bite her. "Lady Patience Whitmore? The woman you were supposed to marry? Her family is hosting a ball and inviting us?" "The Whitmores are nothing if not socially astute," Sebastian said grimly. "They know that refusing to acknowledge our marriage would make them look petty and vindictive. By inviting us and appearing gracious, they position themselves as the wronged party who has risen above the slight. And if we decline, then we look guilty, ashamed, as though our marriage is something to be hidden." He took the invitation from her hands, his jaw tight. "We must attend. It's the only way to put the rumors to rest." The rumors had been building since their wedding, of course. Arabella had seen the whispers in the newspapers, the veiled references in society columns to the Duke of Blackmore's surprising choice of bride. Someone, probably the Whitmores themselves, had leaked the story of the accidental contract, and the Ton was having a field day speculating about what it all meant. "They'll stare at me," Arabella said quietly. "They'll compare me to Lady Patience and find me wanting. I am not. I have never been the sort of woman who shines at balls." "Then we'll make sure you have every advantage." Sebastian's voice softened. "You'll have new gowns, whatever you need. The best modiste in London. Jewels from the Blackmore collection. You will walk into that ballroom as the Duchess of Blackmore, and anyone who dares to find you wanting will answer to me." She should have argued that clothes and jewels wouldn't change who she was underneath. She should have pointed out that no amount of silk and diamonds could transform a plain spinster into the kind of glittering beauty that society admired. But the fierce protectiveness in his voice stole her objections before she could voice them. "Very well," she said instead. "But I should warn you I haven't danced in years. I may step on your toes." His smile was unexpectedly warm. "I have been told my toes are remarkably resilient." The next 2 weeks were consumed by preparations that made Arabella's head spin. Modistes appeared with fabrics and fashion plates. Jewelers brought cases of glittering treasures for her approval. A hairdresser spent an entire afternoon experimenting with her hair while she tried not to fidget. Sebastian involved himself in every decision, expressing opinions about colours and cuts that she would never have expected a duke to possess. "Not the pink," he said, examining a bolt of rose-coloured silk. "It washes out her complexion. The gold, I think it brings out her eyes." "Your Grace has excellent taste," the modiste murmured, shooting Arabella a knowing look. Arabella felt her cheeks heat and tried to focus on the fabric rather than the man beside her. He was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, and his hand rested casually on the small of her back, in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. They touched more often now, a hand on her arm, his fingers brushing hers when they passed documents between them, the press of his palm against her back as he guided her through doors. Small intimacies that shouldn't have affected her as much as they did. The gown that emerged from the modiste's workshop was unlike anything Arabella had ever worn. Golden silk that seemed to capture light, cut in elegant lines that emphasized her figure without being improper, with a neckline that displayed the graceful column of her neck and the gentle swell of her bosom. When she put it on for the final fitting, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. "You look like a duchess," the modiste said with satisfaction. Arabella looked at her reflection, this stranger in gold silk, with honey-brown hair piled in elaborate curls, amber eyes bright against skin that glowed in the candlelight, and wondered if perhaps she was beginning to feel like one too. The night of the Whitmore ball arrived cold and clear, the kind of crisp winter evening that made the gas lamps shimmer and the frost sparkle on the cobblestones. Arabella descended the grand staircase of Blackmore House in her golden gown, the Blackmore diamonds glittering at her throat, and found Sebastian waiting for her in the entrance hall. He was dressed in immaculate evening clothes, black coat, white waistcoat, cravat tied in an elaborate arrangement that must have taken his valet considerable time. His dark hair was brushed back from his forehead, emphasizing the sharp planes of his face, and his grey eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Arabella," he said, and her name on his lips was almost a caress. You are magnificent." She felt her cheeks flush and ducked her head, old habits of self-deprecation rising automatically. "It's the gown, the diamonds. I'm merely wearing them." "The gown and the diamonds are merely fortunate enough to adorn you." He crossed to her and took her gloved hands in his, raising them to his lips. "I mean it, Arabella. You are beautiful. And tonight, all of London will see what I saw in that solicitor's office. A woman covered in ink, arguing about whose fault it was that she'd just accidentally married a duke." His smile flashed, rare and brilliant. "A woman of fire and spirit who refused to be intimidated. A woman worth keeping." He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. "Come, let us go and show society what they have been too blind to see." The Whitmore townhouse blazed with light, carriages queued around the block, the cream of London society streaming through the doors in a river of silk and jewels. Arabella felt her stomach clench with nerves as their carriage inched forward, aware that in a few moments she would have to walk into that glittering assembly and pretend she belonged there. "Breathe," Sebastian murmured, his hand covering hers where it gripped his arm. "You are the Duchess of Blackmore. You outrank nearly everyone in that room. They should be nervous of you, not the reverse." "Easy for you to say." "You've been a duke for nearly a decade, and I've hated every society event I've ever attended. At least tonight I'll have pleasant company." His fingers squeezed hers gently. "We'll face them together, Arabella, whatever happens." Together. The word warmed her more than it should have. Their entrance into the ballroom was everything Arabella had feared, and everything Sebastian had promised. The music faltered briefly as heads turned, conversations dying mid-sentence as the cream of society took in the Duke of Blackmore and his unexpected Duchess. Arabella felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, assessing, judging, comparing her to the mental image of Lady Patience Whitmore that they had all expected to see on Sebastian's arm. She lifted her chin and smiled serenely. Though her heart was pounding so hard, she was certain Sebastian must feel it through her gloved hand. The Earl of Hartington approached First Lady Patience's father, a stout man with shrewd eyes and a politician's practised smile. "Blackmore, we're honoured you could attend, and this must be your Duchess." The pause before the word was barely perceptible, but Arabella heard it, heard the implication that she was not the Duchess he had expected or wanted. "Indeed," Sebastian said coolly. "My wife, Her Grace, Arabella Ashworth, Duchess of Blackmore. Arabella, the Earl of Hartington." "My lord." Arabella curtsied with perfect precision, grateful for the hours her mother had spent drilling proper form into her as a girl. "Thank you for the invitation. Your home is lovely." The Earl's smile flickered. Had he expected her to be awkward? Intimidated? Common? "You're very kind, Your Grace. I hope you'll enjoy the evening. Patience is around here somewhere. I'm sure she'll want to welcome you personally." "How thoughtful," Sebastian said, in a voice that suggested he found it anything but. "If you'll excuse us, We should pay our respects to our hostess." He guided Arabella away, his hand firm on the small of her back, navigating through the crowd with the ease of long practice. People parted before them, some nodding respectfully, others whispering behind their fans, and Arabella kept her smile firmly in place through all of it. "You're doing beautifully," Sebastian murmured in her ear. "They can't take their eyes off you. They're probably trying to spot the ink stains." His laugh, low and warm, drew more curious glances. "The ink-stained bride who captured the coldest duke in London. It would make an excellent novel, don't you think? With a thoroughly improbable plot. The best plots are improbable." He stopped at the edge of the dance floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz. "Dance with me, Your Grace." It wasn't a question. Arabella felt her nerves spike. She hadn't danced in years, hadn't waltzed since her own disastrous come-out when she'd stepped on the toes of every partner unfortunate enough to claim her hand. But Sebastian was already drawing her onto the floor, one hand clasping hers, while the other settled on her waist, with a familiarity that made her shiver. "I warned you about my dancing," she said as they began to move, "and I told you my toes were resilient." His grey eyes smiled down at her. "Besides, you underestimate yourself. You've been doing that since the day we met." "I'm being realistic. You're being afraid." His hand tightened on her waist, guiding her through a turn with effortless grace. "You've spent so long being told you weren't enough that you've forgotten to ask whether the people telling you that were worth listening to. And you think they weren't? I think a woman who can untangle years of household corruption in a week, who can face down a furious duke without flinching, who can transform a household through sheer force of practical competence, that woman is more than enough." His voice dropped, intimate despite the crowded ballroom. "I think perhaps she's everything." Arabella missed a step, and only his steady hand kept her from stumbling. "Sebastian, dance with me, Arabella, and stop thinking about the people watching. There's only us." She let herself surrender to it, to the music, to his guidance, to the impossible fantasy of being exactly where she belonged. They moved together through the waltz, as though they'd been partners for years, rather than weeks, and somewhere in the middle of it, Arabella realized she was actually enjoying herself. When the dance ended, applause scattered through the ballroom, polite but genuine. Sebastian bowed over her hand, and when he straightened, his eyes were warm with something that looked almost like pride. "You see," he said, "not a single crushed toe." Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the moment. "Your Grace, how unexpected to see you here." Lady Patience Whitmore was exactly as beautiful as Arabella had feared, tall and willowy, with pale blonde hair and blue eyes the colour of a winter sky. She wore a gown of ice-blue silk that complemented her colouring perfectly, and diamonds sparkled at her throat and in her hair. She was, in every way, the perfect picture of an aristocratic bride. Everything Arabella was not. "Lady Patience." Sebastian's voice had gone cold again, the warmth of the dance evaporating. "I believe you've met my wife." "We were never formally introduced, actually." Lady Patience's smile was sharp as cut glass. "Though of course I've heard so much about the circumstances of your marriage. The solicitor's office, wasn't it? Some sort of paperwork error?" "A happy accident," Arabella said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Fate works in mysterious ways, I've found." "Fate?" Lady Patience's laugh tinkled like breaking icicles. "How romantic, though I must confess, I always thought marriage should be based on something more substantial than clerical error. Compatibility, perhaps, shared background, an understanding of what life in the ton requires. And I have found that those considerations matter far less than character and courage," Sebastian cut in, his voice glacial. "Qualities my wife possesses in abundance." Lady Patience's eyes flickered something ugly moving beneath the beautiful surface. "Of course. I'm sure she's very capable. I've heard she's been rearranging your household, dismissing servants who have been with the family for years. It must be so refreshing to have a wife who takes such an active interest in domestic matters. The insult was carefully veiled but unmistakable. Arabella felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Sebastian stepped forward, placing himself slightly between her and Lady Patience. My wife has been correcting years of corruption and mismanagement that went unnoticed during my own neglect, he said. The household is more efficiently run than it has been in a decade, thanks to her efforts. I consider myself fortunate to have found a partner with such practical talents. Practical. Lady Patience's smile didn't waver. Yes, that's certainly the word everyone uses. Practical Arabella, who manages accounts and keeps house while prettier girls go to parties. But I'm sure you'll find your way eventually, Your Grace. Perhaps you might start a charitable society or something similarly useful. Lady Patience. Sebastian's voice had dropped to a register that made nearby guests step back instinctively. I suggest you move along before you say something you'll regret. My wife is the Duchess of Blackmore, and she will be treated with the respect that title commands, by everyone. The warning was unmistakable. Lady Patience's perfect composure cracked for just a moment, something ugly flashing in her blue eyes, before she recovered herself. Of course, Your Grace, I meant no offence. She curtsied, the movement somehow mocking. I hope you both enjoy the rest of the evening. She swept away, and Arabella released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Well, she said quietly, that was intolerable. Sebastian's jaw was tight with anger. I should have refused the invitation, made it clear that... No. Arabella touched his arm, drawing his attention back to her. You were right that we needed to come, and you defended me. No one has ever... She stopped, embarrassed by the emotion welling up in her throat. No one has ever stood up for me like that before. Then everyone you've ever known has been a fool. His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. Lady Patience is bitter because she lost something she wanted. That has nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with her vanity. She's beautiful, accomplished, everything a duchess should be. She's cold, vapid, and mean-spirited. Sebastian's grey eyes held hers intently. I spent months negotiating that marriage contract because I believed I didn't want anything more than a political alliance. Meeting you showed me how wrong I was. Arabella's heart stuttered. Sebastian. Not here. He glanced around the crowded ballroom, where curious eyes were still watching them. Dance with me again, and later, when we're home. Yes? But he only shook his head, guiding her back onto the dance floor as a new waltz began. Later, he repeated, and there was a promise in his voice that made her shiver with anticipation. They danced twice more, spoke with various acquaintances, some genuinely welcoming, others merely curious, and made their escape just before midnight. The carriage ride home was quiet, but it was a different quality of silence than they'd shared before, charged, expectant, full of unspoken possibility. At Blackmore House, Sebastian helped her down from the carriage and kept her hand in his as they entered the house. The servants had retired. Only a few candles burned in the entrance hall, casting flickering shadows across the marble floors. Thank you, Arabella said softly, for tonight, for defending me, for everything. You don't need to thank me for treating you as you deserve to be treated. He raised her hand to his lips, as he had done so many times before, but this time he turned her hand over and pressed his lips to the sensitive skin of her inner wrist. Arabella gasped at the sensation. Sebastian. I have been patient, he said, his voice rough. I promised you time to adjust, to decide if this marriage was what you wanted. But I find my patience is reaching its limits. His grey eyes burned into hers. Tell me to stop, Arabella, and I will. But if you don't... She didn't tell him to stop. Instead, she reached up and touched his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the curve of his cheekbone, the surprisingly soft hair at his temple. He stood perfectly still under her exploration, barely breathing. as though afraid any movement might break the spell. "I don't want you to stop," she whispered. Something ignited in his eyes. Triumph, relief, desire. And then his mouth was on hers, and Arabella stopped thinking entirely. The kiss was everything she had never allowed herself to imagine. Tender and fierce, demanding and giving, it consumed her entirely. His hands tangled in her carefully styled hair, sending pins scattering across the marble floor. Her fingers clutched at the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer, as though she could somehow merge them into a single being. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. "Arabella," he murmured, "my practical, extraordinary, beautiful wife. I want—" Whatever he was about to say was lost as she kissed him again, and they stumbled together toward the staircase, her golden gown trailing behind them like a river of sunlight. They never made it to either bedroom. The morning after the ball, Arabella woke in her own bed, having eventually been carried there by a husband who had proven to be both surprisingly tender and thoroughly thorough in his attentions. She stretched languidly, muscles she hadn't known she possessed, protesting pleasantly, and found herself smiling at the canopy above her. She was, she realized with some wonder, happy. The connecting door opened, and Sebastian appeared, already dressed, but with his cravat still hanging loose around his neck. The sight of him, this austere, commanding man, in a state of partial undress, sent a flush of heat through her. "Good morning, Your Grace," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice she had never heard before. "I trust you slept well?" "Remarkably well, considering how little sleeping actually occurred." His smile was slow and wicked. "I have always believed in thorough endeavors." "So I discovered." She sat up, clutching the blankets to her chest, with a modesty that seemed absurd given the previous night's activities. "Sebastian." "Yes?" She didn't know how to say it, this swelling feeling in her chest, this tentative unfurling of something she had spent years trying to suppress. She didn't have words for it yet. "Thank you," she said instead, "for everything." He crossed to the bed and sat on its edge, taking her hand in his. "You still think you need to thank me," he observed. "You still believe that everything good that happens to you is some sort of gift, rather than your due. Old habits. We'll break them." He kissed her knuckles, then her palm, then the inside of her wrist. Together. The word had new meaning now. Together. A partnership, a connection, a future she was only beginning to imagine. It was perhaps an hour later, after Sebastian had demonstrated that his thorough nature extended to morning activities as well as evening ones, that the peace of their new understanding was shattered. The letter arrived just as Arabella was finishing her breakfast, delivered by a footman whose face was carefully blank in the way that suggested he knew its contents were significant. It was addressed to Sebastian, but Arabella recognized the handwriting on the outer envelope, bold, masculine, slightly careless. She had seen it before, on documents in the solicitor's office. Sebastian opened it, scanned the contents, and went very still. "What is it?" Arabella asked, alarmed by the sudden tension in his frame. He didn't answer immediately. When he finally looked up, his face was the cold mask she remembered from their first meeting. All warmth vanished, replaced by the glacial control of a man who expected betrayal at every turn. "It's from my solicitor," he said. "Mr. Hartwell. He writes to inform me that certain documents have come to light, documents that suggest our marriage may not have been as accidental as it appeared." Arabella felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean?" Sebastian handed her the letter. She read it twice, the words blurring before her eyes. References to a clerk's testimony, suggestions of prior correspondence. An insinuation that the contract switch had been arranged in advance, designed to trap the Duke of Blackmore into marriage with a penniless spinster whose family had everything to gain from the connection. "This is absurd," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I would never, Sebastian. You must know." "Must I?" His voice was ice. I chose to believe you, Arabella. Against all logic, against the advice of everyone who warned me that a woman who could accidentally sign a marriage contract might have more cunning than she appeared. I chose to trust my instincts. Your instincts were right. She was on her feet now, the letter crumpling in her fist. I didn't know about any of this. I didn't plan anything. I signed what I was given because I thought it was Cordelia's contract. You know this. You were there. I was there. Yes. I saw what you wanted me to see. A flustered woman, embarrassed by her mistake, protesting her innocence. His laugh was bitter. It never occurred to me that the whole scene might have been orchestrated. The confusion in the office, the clerk handing you the wrong document, your very convincing shock when I confronted you. Because it was real. Tears were burning in her eyes now, but she refused to let them fall. Sebastian, please. Whatever that letter says, whatever evidence they claim to have, it's lies. I swear to you on everything I hold sacred, I did not plan this marriage. He studied her face for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the man who had opened himself to her last night battling against years of carefully constructed defenses. The evidence is detailed, he said finally. Testimony from the clerk who handed you the document. A letter allegedly written by your mother discussing the arrangement with Mr. Hartwell. Financial records showing payments to the solicitor's office in the weeks before our wedding. Fabricated. All of it. My mother couldn't arrange a successful dinner party, let alone a conspiracy to entrap a duke. Arabella's voice was steady now, her practical nature reasserting itself even as her heart cracked. Think about it, Sebastian. If I had planned this marriage, would I have spent the first month fighting with you? Would I have demanded to void the contract? Would I have treated this entire situation as the disaster it initially appeared to be? Perhaps that was part of the performance, protesting too much to avoid suspicion. And the household reforms, the accounting investigation, was that part of my nefarious plan too, to expose corruption in your own household and make you a better master to your servants? She laughed, though there was no humor in it. What possible motive would I have had for any of that, if my only goal was to secure your fortune? Sebastian was silent. She could see him thinking, weighing her words against the damning evidence in that letter. The letter is from Mr. Hartwell, she pressed. The same solicitor whose office allowed this mistake to happen in the first place. The same man who failed to prevent it, who should have been watching those documents more carefully. Doesn't it strike you as convenient that he suddenly produces evidence of a conspiracy, evidence that shifts the blame entirely onto me and away from his own negligence? Something flickered in Sebastian's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the beginning of reason. And Lady Patience's family, Arabella continued, the Whitmores. They have every reason to want our marriage dissolved, every reason to manufacture evidence of a conspiracy, to convince you that you were tricked, so that you might seek an annulment and return to your original arrangement. An annulment now would be difficult, Sebastian said slowly, given that we have consummated the marriage. Yes. Her cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. So perhaps their goal is not annulment, but destruction. If they can convince you that I betrayed you, that our marriage is a lie, they may hope to achieve through misery what they cannot accomplish through law. The cold mask was cracking. She could see the man beneath it, the man who had kissed her so tenderly last night, who had called her extraordinary, who had stood up for her against Lady Patience's venom. I don't know what to believe, he admitted, and the vulnerability in his voice cut her to the bone. Believe this. She crossed to him, taking his hands in hers despite his initial resistance. I came to that solicitor's office as a chaperone for my sister. I signed that document because I was trying to be useful, as I have always been useful, because no one ever taught me that I deserved to be anything more. I did not seek this marriage. I did not plan this marriage. But I have come to... She stopped, the words catching in her throat. To what? His voice was rough. To want it. The admission cost her everything. To want you. Not your title, not your fortune, Not anything but this, what we've built together these past weeks. The conversations, the partnership. Last night, her eyes met his, and she let him see everything she was feeling. The hope, the fear, the desperate need for him to believe her. I am falling in love with you, Sebastian, and I am terrified that this letter will destroy everything before we have a chance to discover what we might become. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then, slowly, his hands tightened on hers. The evidence in this letter, he said carefully, may be fabricated. It is fabricated. I would stake my life on it. But I cannot simply ignore it. If there is any possibility that our marriage was the result of a conspiracy, I need to investigate. I need to be certain. Then investigate. She released his hands and stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. Question whoever you like. Examine whatever evidence exists. But while you're conducting your investigation, ask yourself this. Who benefits from you believing that I betrayed you? Who gains if you cast me aside? She turned and walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. I have been underestimated my entire life, she said quietly. By my mother, by society, by every man who ever looked past me to my prettier sister. I had thought you were different. I had thought you saw me. Arabella. But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps you only saw what you wanted to see: a convenient wife, practical enough to manage your household, passionate enough to warm your bed. Perhaps the Duke of Blackmore is exactly as cold as everyone believes, and I was a fool to imagine otherwise. She opened the door. I will be in my sitting room if you wish to speak with me after you've made your inquiries. But I will not remain in a house where I am treated as a suspect rather than a wife. If you cannot trust me, Sebastian, then perhaps this accidental marriage was a mistake after all. She closed the door behind her with a soft click, and only then allowed the tears to fall. Arabella spent the next 3 hours in her sitting room, staring at account ledgers without seeing them, while the house settled into an unnatural quiet. She heard Sebastian leave, the distant sound of his voice giving orders, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, and felt something inside her fracture with each passing moment of silence. She had laid herself bare before him, had confessed feelings she had barely admitted to herself, and he had said nothing, had offered no reassurance, no declaration of his own, only a cold promise to investigate the evidence against her. Perhaps that was answer enough. The afternoon light was fading when a soft knock came at the door. Arabella straightened in her chair, composing her features into the mask of calm competence she had worn her entire life. Come in. It was not Sebastian. Instead, a young footman, Thomas, she remembered, one of those who had chosen to stay and reform after Mrs. Blackwood's dismissal, entered with a silver tray bearing a letter. This just arrived, Your Grace. The messenger said it was urgent. Arabella took the letter with numb fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar, bold, and somewhat careless, distinctly masculine. She broke the seal and read, Your Grace, I write in haste, knowing I may be placing myself in considerable danger. The evidence presented to His Grace regarding your alleged conspiracy is entirely fabricated. I know this because I was approached to provide false testimony and refused. Others were not so scrupulous. Mr. Hartwell has been in the pay of the Earl of Hartington for some months now. The Whitmores engineered this entire scheme to destroy your marriage and restore Lady Patience to her expected position. The clerk who handed you the contract was bribed to ensure the mistake would occur, though the original plan was for Lady Patience to sign inadvertently, creating grounds for her to claim the Duke had compromised her. Your intervention was unexpected, but the Whitmores adapted their scheme accordingly. I have documentation proving all of this, including letters between Mr. Hartwell and the Earl. I am prepared to deliver them to you, but I dare not come to Blackmore House openly. Meet me at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, at 7 o'clock this evening. Come alone, the Earl has eyes everywhere, and if he suspects I am betraying him, my life will be forfeit. A friend to Justice Arabella read the letter twice, her heart pounding. It could be a trap, of course, a lure to draw her away from the protection of Blackmore House, to silence her or harm her in some way. The instruction to come alone was particularly suspicious. But if it was genuine, if this mysterious correspondent truly had evidence that could prove her innocence and expose the Whitmore's conspiracy, could she afford to ignore it? She looked at the clock on the mantel. 5:30. If she was going to reach Westminster by 7, she needed to leave within the hour. For a long moment, she sat motionless, weighing her options. She should wait for Sebastian, show him the letter, let him handle the situation as was proper for a duke dealing with enemies among the aristocracy. But Sebastian was not here. Sebastian was out investigating the false evidence against her, perhaps even now being fed more lies by Mr. Hartwell and the Whitmores. By the time he returned, it might be too late. The mysterious correspondent might flee, the evidence might disappear, and she would be left with nothing but her word against the carefully constructed case against her. She had spent her entire life being practical, being sensible, waiting for others to act while she managed things quietly in the background. Perhaps it was time to stop waiting. Arabella folded the letter and tucked it into her bodice, then rose and rang for her maid. She would need her warmest cloak. The evening was cold, and churches were notoriously draughty. She was done being passive, done letting others determine her fate. If there was evidence that could save her marriage, she would find it herself. The hack she hired dropped her at the corner of Parliament Street as the bells of Westminster struck 7. St. Margaret's Church loomed before her, its medieval stonework grey and forbidding in the winter twilight. A few pedestrians hurried past, bundled against the cold, but no one paid attention to the woman in the dark cloak who slipped through the church's side door. Inside, the church was dim and silent, lit only by a few guttering candles near the altar. Arabella's footsteps echoed on the stone floor as she moved down the centre aisle, her eyes straining to see into the shadows that gathered in every corner. "Hello?" she called softly. "I received your letter. I'm here." No response. The silence pressed against her ears, heavy and expectant. She walked further into the church, past rows of empty pews, toward the altar with its flickering candles. Perhaps her correspondent was late. Perhaps he was watching from somewhere, ensuring she was truly alone before revealing himself. Perhaps this had been a terrible mistake. "Your Grace." The voice came from behind her, and Arabella spun around to find a figure emerging from the shadows near the side door through which she had entered. A man, young and nervous-looking, dressed in the plain clothes of a clerk. His face was vaguely familiar. She thought she might have seen him at Mr. Hartwell's office, though she couldn't be certain. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I wasn't sure you would. Most ladies wouldn't have the courage." "I am not most ladies." Arabella kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "You have evidence regarding the conspiracy against me?" "I do." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. "Letters, Your Grace. Between Mr. Hartwell and the Earl of Hartington. They lay out the entire scheme, how the contract switch was planned, how the false evidence was manufactured, how they intended to either force an annulment or destroy your marriage from within." He held out the portfolio, and Arabella stepped forward to take it. Her fingers had just closed around the leather when another voice echoed through the church. "I'm afraid I cannot allow you to leave with those documents, Your Grace." Arabella froze. Emerging from behind a pillar, impeccably dressed in evening clothes, as though he had just come from a society dinner, was the Earl of Hartington. "My lord," the young clerk stammered, his face going white. I wasn't... You weren't going to betray me?" The Earl's smile was cold. "No, I rather think you were. I've had my suspicions about you for some time, Jennings. Your conscience was always your weakness." He nodded to someone behind him, and 2 large men emerged from the shadows. Footmen, perhaps, or hired thugs. "Take him. We'll deal with him later." The young clerk, Jennings, let out a cry of fear as the men seized him, and Arabella watched in horror as he was dragged away into the darkness of a side chapel. "Now then." The Earl turned his attention to her, still wearing that cold smile. "The Duchess of Blackmore, I must say, you've caused me a great deal of trouble." "I've caused you trouble?" Arabella's voice came out stronger than she expected, fueled by anger rather than fear. "You manufactured evidence to destroy my marriage. You bribed solicitors and clerks to lie about me. You are attempting to ruin my life, and I am the one causing trouble? Your marriage was never meant to happen, Your Grace. My daughter was to be Duchess of Blackmore. The alliance between our families was carefully planned, the political benefits precisely calculated. And then you, a nobody, a plain spinster of no consequence, stumbled into the middle of it and ruined everything. I stumbled into your own trap." Understanding dawned, and with it a surge of bitter amusement. "The contract switch, it was meant for Lady Patience, wasn't it? She was supposed to accidentally sign the Duke's contract, creating a scandal that would force him to marry her, but I got there first. A miscalculation." The Earl's jaw tightened. The clerk was supposed to give the document to Patience, not to some random chaperone. But you took it upon yourself to sign, and the Duke, for reasons I still cannot fathom, decided to keep you. Perhaps he recognized something in me that you and your daughter cannot see. Arabella clutched the portfolio of letters tighter. Perhaps he values intelligence and character over beauty and breeding. Perhaps he is a fool. The Earl stepped closer, and Arabella forced herself not to retreat. But that is beside the point. The evidence against you has already been delivered. By tomorrow, Blackmore will believe his wife conspired to trap him. Your marriage will be destroyed, and when he casts you aside in disgrace, my daughter will be waiting to offer consolation. Even if he believed your lies, he cannot annul a consummated marriage. No, but he can make your life a living hell. A wife banished to the country, stripped of all status and comfort, while her husband takes his pleasure elsewhere, it is a common enough arrangement among the ton. The Earl smiled. And once you have been thoroughly humiliated, once Blackmore has had time to regret his hasty choice, Parliament can be persuaded to grant a special divorce. It has been done before, for men of sufficient influence. You're mad. Arabella shook her head. Even if you destroyed my marriage, do you truly believe Sebastian would turn to your daughter? The woman whose family orchestrated his wife's downfall? He would never know. The evidence points to you and your grasping family, not to us. We are merely the innocent victims who tried to warn him. The Earl's expression hardened. But I grow tired of explaining myself to a woman who should never have risen above her station. Give me those documents, Your Grace, and I will consider allowing you to leave this church unharmed. No. The word hung in the cold air between them. Arabella saw surprise flicker across the Earl's face. He had expected her to cower, to submit, to behave as the powerless woman he believed her to be. No, he repeated. These documents prove your conspiracy. They prove my innocence, and I will die before I hand them over to be destroyed. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with all the defiance she possessed. You underestimated me, my lord. You thought I was nobody, a plain spinster, easily dismissed, easily destroyed. But I have spent my entire life being underestimated, and I have survived it. I have managed impossible households and balanced desperate budgets and navigated situations that would have broken lesser women. You are not the first bully I have faced, and you will not be the last. The Earl's expression twisted with fury. Seize her! He gestured, and Arabella realized with cold terror that there were more men in the shadows, not just the two who had taken Jennings, but others, closing in from multiple directions. She backed away, clutching the portfolio to her chest, but there was nowhere to go. The altar was behind her, the Earl before her, and his men were everywhere. This was how it ended then. Not with a triumphant return to Blackmore House, evidence in hand, but in a cold church surrounded by enemies. She had gambled everything on the chance to prove her innocence, and she had lost. The first man reached for her, and Arabella swung the portfolio at his head with all her strength. The heavy leather connected with his temple, and he staggered back with a curse. But there were others, too many others, and hands were grabbing at her arms, her cloak, trying to wrest the documents from her grip. "Let her go." The voice rang through the church like a thunderclap, and everyone froze. Sebastian stood in the main doorway, his coat dishevelled and his dark hair wild, as though he had ridden hard to reach this place. Behind him were a half-dozen men in the livery of Blackmore House, and behind them Arabella's heart leaped a constable and several officers of the watch. "Blackmore!" The Earl's voice was steady, but Arabella could see panic in his eyes. "This is not what it appears." "No?" Sebastian strode down the aisle, his grey eyes blazing with cold fury. "It appears that you are holding my wife against her will in a church, having lured her here with a false promise of evidence. It appears that your men are assaulting a duchess. It appears, Lord Hartington, that you have finally revealed yourself as the villain you are. She came here of her own accord. She came because she is brave enough to fight for our marriage, even when I was fool enough to doubt her." Sebastian's gaze found Arabella's, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, not just anger, but anguish, regret, love. "When I returned home and found her gone, found the letter she had received, I knew I had been deceived, and that my doubt had driven her to take desperate action. The evidence was manufactured. I have spent the afternoon tracking down the truth, my lord, with the help of several people who were unwilling to be party to your schemes." Sebastian smiled grimly. "Your clerk Jennings was not the only one with a conscience. Mr. Hartwell's assistant was most forthcoming once he understood the consequences of continued silence." The Earl's face went grey. "You cannot prove—" "I can prove everything." Sebastian stopped a few feet from where Arabella still stood, surrounded by the Earl's men, the portfolio clutched to her chest. "I have sworn statements, copies of the letters you exchanged with Hartwell. A complete account of how you planned to sabotage my marriage, first by trapping me into wedding your daughter through a manufactured scandal, and then, when that failed, by destroying the wife I actually chose." He extended his hand toward Arabella. "Release her, now." The Earl's men hesitated, looking to their master for guidance. For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Arabella could see Hartington calculating his options, weighing the possibility of violence against the certainty of exposure. Then, slowly, he nodded, and his men stepped back. Arabella flew across the intervening space and into Sebastian's arms. He caught her, held her, buried his face in her hair while she clutched the evidence of their enemy's conspiracy between their bodies. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her ear. "Arabella, I'm so sorry. I should never have doubted you. I should never have let you leave thinking I didn't believe you, didn't trust you, didn't—" "Later." She pulled back enough to look into his face. "There will be time for apologies later. Right now, we need to deal with him." Sebastian nodded, releasing her, but keeping one arm firmly around her waist. He turned back to face the Earl, who stood pale and defeated in the candlelit church. "Lord Hartington, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, assault upon a peer's wife, and various other charges that my solicitors will enumerate at leisure." Sebastian nodded to the constable who had accompanied him. "Take him. You cannot do this." The Earl's voice rose with desperation. "I am an Earl of the realm. I have connections, influence. You have nothing." Sebastian's voice was ice. "Your conspiracy has been exposed. Your reputation is destroyed. Your daughter's prospects are ruined." He smiled, and there was no warmth in it. "You set out to destroy my wife, Lord Hartington. Instead, you have destroyed yourself." The constable and his officers moved forward, and despite the Earl's protests, he was escorted from the church in disgrace. His men fled into the night, unwilling to face arrest for their master's crimes. And then, finally, Arabella and Sebastian were alone, or as alone as they could be, with Blackmore servants standing at a respectful distance, pretending not to watch. "How did you know?" Arabella asked. "How did you find me?" "When I returned home and found you gone, I questioned the servants. Thomas told me about the letter that had arrived." I searched your sitting room and found the original in your desk. You copied it before you left, I assume, in case something happened to the messenger's version. I learned long ago to keep records of important correspondence. She managed a shaky smile. A practical habit. A habit that likely saved your life tonight. His arm tightened around her. When I read that letter, I knew it was a trap. Knew that whoever had written it, whether the Earl himself or someone in his pay, intended to harm you. I gathered every man I could find and rode here as fast as the horses could carry us. You came for me. I will always come for you. His grey eyes held hers, and she saw the walls finally, completely down, all his fear and vulnerability exposed. Arabella, I have been a fool, a blind, stubborn, terrified fool who was so afraid of being betrayed that he nearly betrayed the only person who ever truly saw him. Sebastian, let me finish, please. He took her hands in his, the portfolio of evidence pressed between their palms. When I received that letter from Hartwell, every old fear I had came rushing back. My mother left when I was a child, simply walked away one day and never returned. My father spent the rest of his life bitter and broken, convinced that love was a weakness to be avoided at all costs. I swore I would never let anyone close enough to hurt me the way he was hurt. But I would never. I know. I knew it even as I was questioning you, even as I was treating you like a suspect rather than my wife. Some part of me knew the evidence was false. Knew that you were exactly what you appeared to be, a woman of integrity and courage who had stumbled into my life and transformed it beyond recognition. He brought her hands to his lips, kissing each knuckle. But I was afraid. Afraid of how much I felt for you, how quickly you had become essential to my happiness. And fear made me cruel. You weren't cruel. You were hurt. I hurt you. I saw it in your eyes when you walked away from me this morning, and it nearly destroyed me. He released one of her hands to cup her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. I love you, Arabella. I should have said it this morning, when you were brave enough to confess your feelings. I should have told you that I have loved you since you called me arrogant in that solicitor's office, since you stood before me in your practical brown pelisse and demanded to know why I would want to keep you. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she was smiling. And why do you want to keep me? Because you are extraordinary. Because you are brave and brilliant and beautiful, even if you still don't believe it. Because you have transformed my household, my heart, my very understanding of what life can be. He leaned his forehead against hers. Because I cannot imagine facing another day without you beside me, arguing with me, managing me, loving me, despite all my many flaws. You do have quite a few flaws, she agreed, laughing through her tears. A staggering number. You'll have your hands full for the rest of our lives. His lips curved. Is that something you might be willing to undertake? In answer, she kissed him. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss they had shared the night before. This was something deeper, a promise, a commitment, a sealing of the bond between them. When they finally parted, both somewhat breathless, the candles in the church seemed to burn a little brighter. "Take me home," Arabella whispered. "Take me home, husband." Sebastian smiled a real smile, warm and unguarded, and tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. "With pleasure, wife." The scandal, when it broke, was magnificent. The Earl of Hartington was stripped of his seat in the House of Lords, pending investigation of his crimes. Mr. Hartwell was arrested, and his practice dissolved. Lady Patience Whitmore retreated to a distant estate in the north, her prospects of a brilliant match ruined beyond repair. And the Duke and Duchess of Blackmore became the toast of London society, not despite their unconventional beginning, but because of it. "They're calling it the love match of the decade," Cordelia reported during her first visit to Blackmore House, some 3 weeks after the dramatic events at St. Margaret's Church. She was married herself now. The contract with Viscount Pemberton had been signed and executed without incident, and practically glowing with the self-satisfaction of a beautiful woman who had achieved her expected destiny. Everyone says the Duke was so besotted with you that he refused to let you escape, even when you tried to void the contract. It's terribly romantic." "That's not precisely what happened," Arabella said, but she was smiling. "Of course it isn't. Real life is never as interesting as the stories people tell about it." Cordelia examined her reflection in the drawing-room mirror, patting an already perfect curl into place. "But you must admit, it makes a better tale than my sister accidentally signed the wrong document and the Duke couldn't be bothered to fix the mistake." "Much better," Arabella agreed dryly. Cordelia turned from the mirror, and for a moment her perfect social mask slipped, revealing something more genuine beneath. "I'm glad it worked out, Bella. Truly. You deserve to be happy." It was perhaps the most sincere thing her sister had ever said to her. Arabella felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you, Cordy." "Yes, well, don't expect me to make a habit of sentiment. It's exhausting." Cordelia picked up her gloves and began pulling them on. "Now, I really must go. Pemberton is taking me to the theatre tonight, and I need at least 3 hours to prepare. You understand?" "Of course." After her sister had swept out in a flurry of silk and perfume, Arabella sat alone in the drawing-room, looking around at the space that had become hers. The room was different now, warmer, more welcoming, with fresh flowers on every surface and afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that the servants no longer feared to approach. The whole house had changed in the weeks since her marriage, as though Blackmore House itself had been waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Or perhaps it had been waiting for her. "Deep thoughts?" She looked up to find Sebastian in the doorway, watching her with the expression of focused attention that still made her heart skip. He had been in meetings all afternoon, something to do with the shipping bill that had originally motivated his planned alliance with the Whitmores, but his cravat was loose and his hair slightly dishevelled, as though he had been running his hands through it in frustration. "I was thinking about transformation," she said. "How much things can change in a short time." "For the better, I hope." "For the better." She held out her hand, and he crossed the room to take it, settling onto the sofa beside her. "Your meetings went well." The bill passed. Without Hartington's opposition, there was no significant resistance. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "It seems being married to a notorious social sensation has certain political advantages. Everyone wanted to discuss you rather than shipping regulations. How tedious for you." "Not at all. I rather enjoy hearing people praise my wife's courage and spirit. It confirms my own excellent judgment in keeping her." She laughed and leaned into his shoulder. "Your judgment was terrible. You kept a wife you didn't even mean to acquire." "The best decision I never made." He kissed the top of her head. "Are you happy, Arabella? Truly?" She considered the question seriously. Happiness had always seemed like something that happened to other people, to beautiful Cordelia, to charming debutantes, to women who fit easily into the roles society expected of them. Arabella had never expected it for herself. But here she was, married to a man who loved her, mistress of a household that ran smoothly under her management, respected by servants who had learned to trust her, acknowledged by society as a woman of courage and consequence. "Yes," she said, "truly." His arm tightened around her. "Good, because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." It was, she reflected, a very practical sentiment, and also deeply romantic. Perhaps there had never been a contradiction between the two. The morning was bright with spring sunshine when Arabella descended the stairs of Blackmore Abbey, Sebastian's country estate in Hampshire, 8 years after the autumn day when she had signed the wrong document in a London solicitor's office. The countryside was dressed in its finest green, apple blossoms nodding in the orchards, and through the open windows of the great hall came the sound of children's laughter. 3 voices, to be precise, in varying pitches of excitement. "Mama! Mama! Come quickly!" Arabella smiled and quickened her pace, emerging through the French doors onto the broad terrace that overlooked the south lawn. There, Sprawled on the grass in a most undignified position was the Duke of Blackmore, being enthusiastically besieged by 3 small persons. Henry, the eldest at 7, had his father pinned by sitting squarely on his chest. Charlotte, 5 years old, and already displaying her mother's practical determination, was attempting to tickle Sebastian's ribs while he pretended to writhe in agony. And little Edward, just 3, was contributing to the assault by hitting his father repeatedly with a wooden sword. "Mercy!" Sebastian cried dramatically. "I surrender. Your Grace, help me." Arabella settled into a chair on the terrace, arranging her skirts with deliberate slowness. "I'm afraid you're on your own, Your Grace. I wouldn't dare interfere with such a superior fighting force." "Traitor. Strategist," she corrected. "I know when to retreat." Sebastian somehow managed to roll over, dislodging Henry and catching Charlotte in one arm, while Edward continued his sword assault with gleeful abandon. "You will all suffer for this treachery. When I regain my feet—" "If you regain your feet," Henry interjected. At 7, he had already developed his mother's talent for pertinent observations. "When I regain my feet, there will be consequences. Terrible consequences involving no pudding and early bedtimes." "Papa wouldn't." Charlotte fixed him with her mother's amber eyes, utterly confident. "Papa loves us." "Papa does love you. But Papa is also going to remember this the next time you ask for a pony." Sebastian managed to sit up, pulling all 3 children into his lap in a laughing, squirming pile. "Now then, I believe Nurse mentioned something about lessons? Not on such a beautiful day, surely." Arabella rose and moved to join them on the grass, heedless of her cream-coloured muslin dress. "Let them play a little longer. They've been cooped up all week with the rain." "You spoil them." "I love them. There's a difference." She settled beside him, and little Edward immediately abandoned his father to climb into her lap. "Besides, I distinctly remember someone ordering extra dessert sent up to the nursery last night because the children looked peaked." They did look peaked. They looked like perfectly healthy children angling for sweets, and you fell for it completely. Sebastian grinned, unrepentant. At 39, he wore his years lightly. There was silver at his temples now, and lines around his eyes, but they were lines carved by laughter rather than severity. The cold, forbidding duke who had terrorized servants and kept the world at arm's length had vanished so completely that newcomers to the household sometimes didn't believe the old stories. But Arabella remembered. She remembered the ice in his eyes on that first day, the cutting fury in his voice as he accused her of ruining his carefully laid plans. She remembered the walls he had built around himself, the fear that had made him push away anything that might become important enough to hurt him. She remembered watching those walls come down, brick by brick, as he learned to trust her, learned to love her, learned to open his heart to the children who had come to fill it so completely. "What are you thinking?" Sebastian asked, catching her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about how far we've come." She reached out to brush a strand of dark hair from Henry's forehead. He had his father's colouring, though his eyes were amber like hers. "About where we started, and where we are now." "Any regrets?" "None." She met his eyes, letting him see the truth of it. "Not one." "Not even signing that contract?" She laughed. "Especially not that. It was the best mistake I ever made." "Mama signed the wrong document," Charlotte announced to no one in particular. She had heard the story 100 times and never tired of it. "And Papa said she was his now, and she was very cross about it." "I was extremely cross," Arabella confirmed. "Your father was very high-handed." "What does high-handed mean?" "It means Papa thought he knew best," Sebastian said. "And as it turns out, Papa was right." "Papa is always right," Edward declared loyally. At 3, he still thought his father was the most magnificent being in existence. This would probably change, but for now it was rather endearing. "Papa is occasionally right," Arabella corrected, "and Mama is right the rest of the time. That's why we make a good team." Sebastian's hand found hers in the grass, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "The best team," he agreed. The children, sensing an opportunity while their parents were distracted by sentiment, scrambled up and ran off toward the orchard, where the apple blossoms made perfect missiles for warfare. Arabella watched them go with a full heart. "Happy?" Sebastian asked, the same question he had asked 8 years ago and countless times since. "Always." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Although I am a bit concerned about your shipping investments. The quarterly reports came in yesterday, and there are some discrepancies in the American accounts." He laughed. "Only you could move from romantic reflection to financial analysis in a single breath." "It's one of my many charms." "It is." He kissed her temple. "I love you, Arabella Ashworth. I loved you when you were a practical spinster with ink on her fingers. I love you now that you're a duchess who terrifies my accountants. I'll love you when we're old and grey and still arguing about the household ledgers. We never argue about the household ledgers. You simply concede that I'm right and save us both time." "That's because you're always right about the household ledgers." He pulled her closer. "Among other things." In the orchard, Charlotte had gained possession of a cache of apple blossoms and was defending it valiantly against her brothers. Her shrieks of triumph carried across the lawn, punctuated by Edward's outraged protests and Henry's strategic commands. "Should we intervene?" Sebastian asked. "Give them 5 more minutes. Charlotte has it well in hand." "She certainly does. I wonder where she gets that from." Arabella smiled and said nothing. Some questions didn't need answering. The sun climbed higher, warming the terrace and painting the gardens in shades of gold and green. In the distance, the children's battle evolved into a collaborative effort to build something ambitious out of fallen branches. The household hummed along smoothly, managed by servants who had long since learned to respect their practical duchess. And somewhere in London, society was probably still talking about the love match of the decade, now nearly a decade old, and still going strong. Arabella closed her eyes and let the peace of the moment wash over her. She had spent so many years believing she was meant for nothing more than usefulness, that passion and love and happily ever after were for other, worthier women. She had resigned herself to spinsterhood, to being overlooked, to a life of practical service without any expectation of joy. And then she had signed the wrong document. It wasn't how fairy tales were supposed to begin. There had been no glass slipper, no magical transformation, no prince who fell in love at first sight. Instead, there had been an argument in a solicitor's office, a furious duke, and a contract that bound them together before either of them was ready. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the best love stories weren't the ones that began perfectly. They were the ones that began with mistakes and misunderstandings, with two flawed people who shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. The ones where love was built brick by brick, through patience and forgiveness, and the daily choice to keep trying even when it was hard. Sebastian's arm tightened around her, and she felt his lips brush her hair. "Still happy?" he murmured. Arabella smiled, keeping her eyes closed, savouring the warmth of the sun and the strength of his embrace and the distant sound of their children's laughter. "Always," she said, "always."